I caught your slightly more cynical retrenchment one this morning.
Oh, my rant this morning. Yeah, I was as I was thinking about the nonsense, this marketing piece. They think they're so clever, right? With this, oh, we're going to roll out this new organizational idea to the faculty, but in order to make them feel like they're participating, we'll do it in the form of a survey. I don't know. I was a little bit. I guess I was feeling
Yes,
cynical about that.
yes. You came over. The but for odd reasons, there was a short-term spy series back in the UK in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, called Sandbaggers,
Hmm.
and it had this guy who was director of operations and was always fighting against the establishment to try and get things done.
Mhm.
And even though some of the time the things he wanted to do was sort of naughty, shouldn't do that. But
Of course.
so but he partly because he was he was James Bond in a suit, but in the office and it was a cheap program, so it went overseas to Russia and Turkey a couple of times, but they were sort of backside of France somewhere.
Mm.
It did go to Prague, and it did go to Malta, and it did go to Gibraltar. And whenever they went to one of those places, it did 2 or 3 episodes in a visit, and then they got staged through, so they didn't have to go out repeatedly. And it was also one of those programs where the primary office scene, if you pushed on the wall hard enough, it would move, as opposed to this is SIS's office. It's supposed to be
Yeah, this is supposed to be a fortress. Yeah.
as it is now.
Yeah.
Now that we all know which building it is anyway, whereas before. So the current SIS building, which was the first time they built for themselves, and everybody knows it's the one that's just on the south of the Thames at Vauxhall. It was also the first time that I actually acknowledged, as a government,
that it
SIS. Anyway, so Neil Burnside, the lead character, is a real cynical bastard, and but he also sees it a bit like you were commenting, where he got manoeuvred into a position, and of course, some of the time the manoeuvring is colleagues within the backstabbing office, and the other time is when the manoeuvring was being done by the KGB. And it got worse when they overlapped.
Interesting. The show that I remember from the 60s, the British spy show that I remember from the 60s was The Prisoner.
Oh, yeah, that was a bit of fantasy more than anything. But that was a takeoff when Danger Man got run its course.
Yes.
Patrick McGowan was the lead.
And because he had been Danger Man, right?
Yeah.
And it looks like Chris is arriving. Mark was with us for a minute and then he dropped off, so maybe he's having technical difficulties. I've had a busy week. I did actually look in the community forum, and yes, you're right, the change log has broken. I think there was an update that kind of wiped out all the plugins, which I haven't kind of resolved yet. There is yeah, and there were some interesting things that people in the last week or so have kind of linked to and stuff in the community forum that I haven't, but I will kind of go back and look at because it looks like interesting stuff. So yeah, I had sort of tried to suggest that I would try harder to be in the Obsidian vault, and I haven't achieved that yet, but I still have hopes. So I guess that's where that's at. I did actually set up a website as Chris suggested, and I was going to, and I grabbed a kind of a budget ISP, and that really didn't work out for me. So I actually changed the name because I had registered a domain name with this kind of budget ISP. I was going to do it as danalasso.net, and so then I figured that I had actually bought that IP through, or I bought that that domain name through the ISP, and I thought, well, it's going to be tied up for a while before I can shake it free. So I created another. So I went to Reclaim, which Chris suggested, and that seems to be working all right. So I called it Dr. Dan Alasso all together, and because another friend that I have around who is a kind of a nonprofit consultant. She was an executive director of an organization, and she said, well, if you're you should have a website of your own. She also was kind of suggesting this, and she said, and if you call yourself Dr. Dan Alasso, then you can say, well, I'm I have these, it's sort of, I kind of at first thought it was kind of boasty, but I don't know. It allowed me because it was something that I'd never used before. It did allow me to get the .com rather than a .net or anything else, along the lines, which makes them more difficult for people to find, I think. So anyway, I spent some time just trying to figure out how to, to sort of reacquainting myself with that, because it had been years, like a decade, and 3 major releases since I had used the app that I used to use, RapidWeaver, for that. So I think the last one I used was 6, and now it's like 9.2 or something.
I thought you were old enough to be writing raw HTML, Dan.
Well, I used to. I was a Unix system administrator, and I did know. I could write VI and shell scripts and stuff like that. But I never did it to run my own web. I do remember though. Remember Microsoft had Front Page, and it was this fabulous little web design app,
Yeah.
and then it went away. That was the first thing I think I ever used.
I kind of had my money on you going to NeoCities, really.
Well, never say never, I guess. But yeah, so I thought I would, and as I did that, actually, and this kind of relates to the Obsidian thing, when I got a new version of RapidWeaver that allowed me to open all these old projects for all these websites that I used to have, from 2008, 2009, 2012, when I moved here to Bemidji, and a lot of that stuff, that reading, I used to just blog about what I was reading all the time, or what was happening, and what projects I was doing, when I moved here and decided to try to be a hobby farmer or whatever, and all that is there, and I'm thinking, well, all that's there, and all these kind of all these references, all these ideas, all these sort of names and books and and stuff, it's all there, and none of it's in Obsidian. So I'm thinking, well, okay, maybe as I kind of troll through this stuff, maybe if I put some of this in Obsidian and link it, maybe I'll create a whole new set of links that'll allow me to discover some things that I've been interested in for the longer term than has really kind of occurred to me. So yeah, Max did have Apache. Yeah, I remember Max when they had HyperCard. Love HyperCard. I've probably gone on and on about that in the past already.
That'll cast in wannabes.
Yeah. So yeah, that was Andy Hirschfeld, right? That was the guy who created MacWrite and MacDraw. So he had a big impact on the early Mac user interface and stuff. Oh, MacPaint, right?
I must admit, this week I had to explain why CR, as in carriage return, was an actual thing.
Oh, yeah.
Because and it's like it's not quite there yet, but people dial telephone numbers, and you sort of do this with your finger.
Yep.
You don't do that.
Right.
Or I don't do any of those now. I just go,
oh, there you go.
Siri, phone Fred, and and it was in the context of having the ding dong over, do you want to use cash or do you want to use card? And if you're using cash, are you carrying a supercomputer in your pocket? But parallel with, I'll physically eat anything, but if I'm going to drink some water, I want bottled water, not out of tap. As in, why do we balance risks the way that we do, rather than with numbers? So it's like, you've got the whole Homeland Defense and TSA all saving you.
Yeah, from another sneaker bomber.
a couple of thousand people a year, versus there's all those people called citizens exercising their Second Amendment rights, just blowing everybody away, especially when their mummy takes them across state lines because they're not allowed to drive. But apparently the guy's not a killer.
Right.
Legally so, apparently.
Well, I don't know about the specific case that you're probably referring to there, but yeah, he's actually managed to get some libel cases won, apparently, where people have said he's a killer. Court said I wasn't, therefore you're telling lies. But then, of course, there's all those miscarriages of justice where people get let out 10, 15, 20, 30, 35 years later, including in the UK, of course. As, sticking with the terrorists, we have 2 sets of Irish convicted groups. So the Birmingham 6 and the Something 4 were all found subsequently to be not the right group of Irishmen. And so sometime down the line... But they were guilty of being Irishmen.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely guilty of being Irishmen. And I joke here, partly because of all you lot are, tax dodging tea terrorists, quite frequently, as any of those tax dodging tea terrorists want to become subjects again of Charlie, I'm sure we'll take them back. You've at least got the advantage of most of you almost speak English, etc. Whereby at the moment, the funniest meme I've seen in the last week or so is like a 4x4 grid. Or maybe probably less than that. It's probably a 3x3 grid for each year since prisoner number, whatever his number is, has been saying lock her up, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. And then, of course, this year he hasn't said it. Because you lock up a political person, that's an affront to their ability to run for office.
Yeah.
Except he's quite happy to say lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. Not only when he's president, but when he's running against her for a political purpose.
Right.
And since.
Well, yeah, and well, he always sort of had the, you know, the out that, well, you know, that's just hyperbole. That's just in fun. That's just things you say at rallies are not, you know, you know, an indication of how you're going to run your Justice Department. So I mean that was always, and you know, and to some extent, that kind of is a viable excuse or defense in an age when nobody believes that anybody is telling the truth when they get to a podium in front of a set of microphones
or cameras even.
Yeah, right.
But then the one that makes me wonder as to what your next step is when he's being recorded that says, oh, this is secret, I shouldn't show it to you. The generals gave it to me, I shouldn't still have it. I could have declassified it when I was the president, but I didn't, so it's still secret. But I shouldn't show it to you. What do you do then?
Yeah.
And,
well,
that's
that
not
whole, right. And if you're talking about the let's invade Iran plan, you know, I think there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of craziness around that too, right? Because it's sort of like, well, okay, the military should have contingency plans for all kinds of things that we wouldn't actually choose to do if we had a choice. You know, that's them being responsible. So I don't understand if that, you know, if what they're arguing about is in, you know, is like in that category, or if it's a new American century, you know, kind of Paul Wolfowitz, you know, blueprint of, you know, how we want to invade the, you know, Iran, you know, take advantage of Iran to invade Iraq in, you know, that in the run up to the war on terror. I don't think we'll ever have enough information to make a determination on that. And that's one of the things that, you know, Pat, you've turned your back to the camera. But Pat, one of the, you know, we've disagreed on some of these things in the past. And I think that that I don't, you know, in a lot of these cases, I think I don't really have enough information. You know, my hunches or my biases or my cynicism, you know, suggests this to me, but, you know, I certainly don't know enough to, you know, to be able to say one way or the other, you know, what I think it really is.
It's the one thing I think of it is why does he feel he should still have a copy, particularly when he's been asked give stuff back. Now, if this had all happened in like the first 2 months, after he changed, I would have a lot of sympathy for him in the sense of there's a lot of stuff to sort through, and I got to take the laundry out first. Okay, yeah. But we're now several years down the line. They've had to go and get it. He's on record of saying, "Let's go and move stuff before they come and get it, so they don't find it, etc., etc., etc." Right. Anyway, but of course, invading Iran rather, brings me back, of course, to my almost favourite TV show of the West Wing. And this is after Leo McGarry's retired because of a heart attack. And CJ's been made chief of staff. Happens to jokingly say do we have any plan to invade Canada? And the general say, yeah, would you like us to brief you on it? So, of course, yes. I just wonder what the plan is to invade the UK again.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. It's weird. I mean, there are, you know, probably contexts in which this is not what Chris says, these are his free lunch. Yeah, he I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I think it might be it might be as simple as, I mean, that I do think that there are definitely double standards being applied, right? That, you know, that what I mean, that in a, you know, that in a very sloppy information security environment, you know, to pick out one person and go after them because they happen to be a political enemy is problematic. So, you know, and so I don't think, I mean, a lot of it, for me, a lot of it doesn't sort of rise above that level of, you know, kind of the bickering noise. And yeah, and maybe, yeah, maybe in a, you know, in a pristine, you know, sort of a, you know, information ecosystem, I would be more, I don't know. I would think it was more of a thing, but I don't think there's a lot of, you know, I think it's that I think is, you know, qualifies for the designation of a nothing burger. But in any case, one of the, you know, some of the things that I think I was just sort of listening as I was kind of going about my morning this morning. I was listening to the 10th chapter, and yeah, character. Yeah, well, and also I think that, you know, I mean, probably, you know, for a guy, yeah, the author doesn't, yeah. So she really, you know, I think it's probably, I don't know, maybe, I don't know Eric Conway's, I haven't seen him talk or anything, but I do think that Naomi doesn't like Friedman. They raced very quickly past the whole Chicago boys in Chile thing. I mean, for me, I guess I was a Latin American historian for a while, so that was, you know, I was focused on that, and that was like a big deal. You know, the idea that would be, you know, that, I mean, you know, they talk about, you know, kind of this idea that there's an ironic passage, there's an ironic section where Friedman talks about sort of freedom of speech and you know, and all this stuff, and he actually uses capitalism protection top of what I would, what my Kindle thinks is page 377. Friedman similarly argued that capitalism protected freedom of thought, using Hollywood as an example, which seemed very ironic to me. You know, that there were these you know, that it was the Red Scare, and there were these people being blacklisted and prevented from, you know, from working as actors or writers or directors or whatever. It does, I mean, and that just that seemed like a small example, you know, and I thought Chile was the big example of, you know, how do you not have cognitive dissonance about the idea, oh yeah, I'm all about freedom, and I'm working for this guy Pinochet, who's disappearing people, and, you know, who took over in a CIA sponsored coup. That was bizarre to me, and I wasn't aware of that, you know, when I was, you know, and I think, you know, I guess that kind of goes back to the, you know, to the what information do you have stuff that we have, the issue that we have now, I guess we had then too, because, you know, when I was going to the Foundation for Economic Education, you know, in the early 80s, you know, and I was, you know, reading Capitalism and Freedom, I was not aware that these dudes were, you know, were doing economic planning for this, you know, brutal dictatorship in South America. National
Well, a lot of that stuff too, it kills me how the arguments they're making, and I think my favorite chapter so far was 7, with the kind of the infiltration of religion into all of this discussion.
Mhm.
But it's the overlap of democracy and some other thing.
Mhm.
In this case, it's religion a little bit, and it's capitalism.
Mhm.
And if anything, human history has shown us that you can have different religions, different political structures, and different societies and other admixtures of culture all been thrown in, and they, to a great extent, they don't affect anything. And if you look at the modern world, all the democracies that have different religions and even different levels of capitalism to socialism, if you want to look at those as a thing, show that the rabidness with which all these people are saying you can't have democracy without the Christianity or without the capitalism, and you certainly can't do it without any kind of socialism. Well, we know better. There are countries that do those things and do them very successfully, and some do them actually better than the US is doing them from a socioeconomic perspective. um,
Mhm.
but part of it is the time that they lived in, and they were literally, the biggest fight that was going on was
Mhm.
the anti-communism push. So everybody is getting into it. So, and a
Yeah.
couple months back, I read uh, Robert Hutchins' introduction to the Great Books series, and he literally, as because of the time period he wrote that many, I think he wrote it in 50, 51. It came out in late 51, 52. He literally took democracy and tacked it on to the humanities, essentially, and said we can't have the humanities in this great conversation without democracy. It's the core of the everything, and it's
Right.
because so many people had this heavy belief in democracy as a thing. This is what's going to save us.
Mhm.
The question became, what can we attach onto it? How can we attach our pet wagon, whether it's in his case the humanities, or in the case of these politicians and academicians, how can we attach capitalism and freedom and evil, or even religion? How can we attach those things to this juggernaut that's rushing us forward?
Mhm.
Christianity had survived for 2,000 years before any of them knew what capitalism, democracy were.
Right. Right.
So you
Well,
can't.
and that idea that there's some type of binary, right? That we can't have, that because we have this kind of cartoon image of the bad world, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? And we know that it is, that it's a non, it's a world without a religion, although communism is sort of the state religion. And that's the thing that sort of strikes me, is that there's that one of the things that one of the reasons, when I had that argument with the minister at the Foundation for Economic Education, one of the things that I think attracts that connection between religion and this sort of market fundamentalism is that it is sort of fundamentalism. It is a set of beliefs, and they talk about Friedman in that way in chapter 10 too, right? That it's not scientific. It's a series of sort of articles of faith and assumptions based on a worldview rather than on an empirical examination of statistics and stuff like that. And so that, in my mind, has an obvious affinity with religious thinking. right? That, that there are, and also, and also there's a, there's kind of a, there's kind of a, of a, of a, kind of a mental process where you sort of gravitate towards sort of canonical texts, right, towards scriptures, right? So, so for Friedman, maybe that's Mises, right? Or a particular reading of Adam Smith, not a complete reading, but the highlights that he wants to, but there was a moment in that chapter too where where they're saying, well, you don't, it doesn't require any type of resorting to evidence or data or observation. It's just, if you have a great quote from Adam Smith, boom, case closed, argument sustained. And that allows them to ignore the examples of Scandinavia and European social democracy, that are hugely successful, and can't be explained except the well, wait a minute, the other shoe will drop and they will turn into Nazi dictatorships at some point. Just wait.
You can build your Nazi dictatorship on Jesus's life if you want. You just have to get everybody to quit paying attention to that treat your neighbor as yourself bit of business, and
right.
You can find all the rest is written in there.
That's the beauty of these of the Bible, but also of many complicated books, right? Is they're not necessarily just consistent. I mean, one of the things that, go ahead, sorry.
Consistent, and not even consistent with what you yourself believe. So, these things were written in and of times that didn't have concepts that we have now today, and know and acknowledge, and everything's fine. But
yeah, well, it's weird because I didn't grow up in a religion really. So I was really shocked when I learned that there was, and the religion that I was most, that I ended up getting most familiar with was the Episcopal religion in America, which is kind of Church of England. And, and the thing that blew my mind was that they didn't just sort of open up the book and randomly read it. There was a set of readings that they had marked out for, on a 3-year rotation. And this is the reading for this week. This is the Old Testament. This is the New Testament. If you want a Psalm, this is the one, and that these things were managed to that degree so that you got the right message and not the wrong message.
Well, but part of it wasn't even that. It was, if you want to think of it as a blogging schedule, and that structure actually comes from its predecessor, the Catholic Church, who essentially broke up the Bible so that if you're going to Mass every day, you're not going to get the same 10 famous readings all the time.
Right.
You'll put some of the biggest readings will always occur usually on Sundays, and in most churches on Wednesdays, because that's the other midday of the week where you might go. Those are going to be the big hard hitters, and the super big messages are going to hit on the holidays.
Right.
And then if you're doing daily Mass, then you're going to get all the boring stuff in between. But it also creates, and it's mirrored, I think it's in chapter 7, that structure is mirrored in this book with how they roll out these theories. Is I can take this idea and I'm going to roll it out and use my newsletter to tell all these ministers, talk about this topic on this Sunday everywhere, so it infiltrates the culture.
Right.
So you create a schedule, and within the Catholic Church, ostensibly the goal is let's keep it mixed up, and on a 3 or a 4-year schedule, you'll essentially have read the whole Bible, which in an illiterate society, you need somebody to read to them.
But you don't. That's part of the problem. Is over that 3-year schedule, you don't actually read every word. In part because both the Anglicans and the Catholics don't even agree what's in the Bible. Right?
Yeah.
There's a huge overlap. There's still odd bits and pieces that are different. And then of course you've got things like the WASP end of the world adds, oh, rapture. Never mentioned.
Well, that's, but that's part and parcel with most Americans don't, and probably other people in other countries too. Let's not be precious about it. But most people think the Bible is a thing that somebody sat down and wrote cover to cover in a few years. And here it is, fully formed from the head of Zeus.
Right.
Oh, gosh, it's the Bible.
And in English.
Not a whole bunch of individual books, mostly by people we have no idea who actually wrote over the span of more than 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Most people could not tell you those facts.
Yeah.
And in English, of course.
Of course.
Oh, yeah, of course it was. Yeah, we don't.
Yeah. So, and of course, Jesus is blonder than you are, Chris.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, yeah.
But one of the things I was going to say a few paragraphs back, actually, was, so how many people on the Zoom had bacon this morning?
No, did not.
That was in this book too, wasn't it? Chapter 3-ish.
It was an option. I missed the bacon. I missed the bacon. Actually, there was bacon in the fridge, and my wife said, "Shall we have bacon?" I said, "I'm kind of saving it for
So
liver."
One of the other thing, of course, given where I am, I can get bacon just as easy as I could when I was at home. Yet I'm permitted to walk through a doorway that says no Muslim. Because there is in the bigger supermarket, you don't get it in the small ones, but in the bigger supermarket, there's a doorway which may or may not have a door, but above the doorway it will always say no Muslims.
So it's the bacon area.
And you go in there and there's all the pork and bacon. So, and it's all American, Canadian, Dutch, British, sausages, bacon, pizzas. So even the bacon pizzas are in, or the pork pizzas are in the pork section. Right? And the one thing we don't have here is you can't buy alcohol at supermarkets. You have to go to a liquor shop. And again, it says no Muslim. So what you often get is the Arab turns up with his
white friend.
With his Hindu driver. The Hindu driver goes out because the Hindu driver's got an alcohol-free card, get out of jail free card, that can go and spend same money, come back with crates of beer and wine and whatever, put it in the Arab's car and drive them.
Wow.
So
yeah,
and to make sure they make money out of it, there's two brands of liquor store, and they're both government owned.
Yep. It's yeah.
Well, and some of that too, if you're watching the data. So the US should have known there was going to be a big opioid issue, because they're getting data from every drugstore about what's being sold in every town. So you can look at middle of nowhere Ohio and see they're getting shipments of opioids that are 10 times larger than the town itself can sustain. And they should have just known, like, that's a red flag. Like, this town is not big enough to support this level of opioid consumption. Where is it going?
Yeah.
And the government similarly can say there are not enough Hindus here in the country unless and even if they were drinking it like water, probably could not consume that much. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Other than just lying to ourselves, but It's easy to pretend the emperor has no clothes apparently now.
Yeah, it's weird. There's you know, I was struck by that. Actually, I mentioned bullshit jobs to somebody this week who wasn't that familiar with it, the Graeber book, and it wasn't in here last Saturday. I don't think it was since then. And they said, well, what about bullshit? That, you know, there's that other, you know, kind of famous essay on bullshit. You know, and maybe, you know, maybe that was a, you know, I sort of didn't pay much attention to that at the time, but, you know, but the idea behind that particular essay or article, if I remember it, was that bullshit was about not I mean, the distinction that the author made, if I remember it correctly, was that the liar sort of depends on there being truth, right? Because they're trying to subvert the truth in order to gain something, right? There is a truth. I'm gonna hide it from you, or I'm gonna tell you an untruth, you know, that will give me some type of an advantage. And in distinction to that, this particular in this essay, the author's thesis was that people who were bullshitters had no actual interest in the truth. They were basically people who were sort of untethered or unconnected, and you know, and had no. It wasn't really in their interest that. You know, that they were saying something that was specifically untrue, and they knew what truth was, and you know, and they were, you know, and they were doing it for a reason, but just that the gates are open and anything goes, which I thought was kind of an interesting distinction in the context of, again, going back to sort of religion and how these, you know, how these economic arguments kind of take on, you know, take on different characteristics that aren't about evidence-based truth claims. They're about belief-based truth claims.
Well, the one that I mean, for my sins, I've never read Friedman, other than I know who he is, but that's about it. Is particularly for chapter 10. And particularly with all the climate change and the biodiversity losses and all that stuff, the big thing from there seems to be the lack of a workable solution if their theory of freedom is true. Why are they not all dead from pollution? Or why are they not suffering from pollution? You know? As in, because there's quite a lot in chapter 10 about the pollution effect.
Yeah.
And the you don't have the freedom to impose regulation to limit pollution. Yet that pollution is going to kill me or give me a significant less quality of life. You know, and for here, for instance, although Dubai is not by historically the worst, we do seem at the moment to be trying to gain the world record for air quality, black. And so I couldn't two mornings ago, 3 mornings ago, I couldn't see the rising sun disk because it was just and so I checked. There's a Swiss-based air pollution satellite thing that publishes data on an hourly basis. Correct? And I checked, and we were sort of something stupid like 280 score, which was only like 10 below the world record. And the worst place in the US on the same schedule was 50 odd places down. So this is all the big cities got a number.
Mhm.
50 odd places down, and the score was less than half,
Mm.
and it was Chicago.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, we've got,
and it's,
I live in the place with the cleanest air probably in North America, except when Canada is burning. And so this
yes, and I was
different
and,
experience.
and of course it's summer, and so you've got all the forest fires.
Mhm.
And I can remember a few years back there was so 2010, 2011, there was a massive volcano in Iceland, and that put aircraft on the ground like 9/11 did.
Mhm.
And people got trapped here because they couldn't go home. Because you can't just get on a plane and go the other way. Because it's just too far in many cases. If you're trying to get from here to East Coast, you've got to go past Iceland, basically. And it's like you can't market Iceland's volcanoes. Fine, that's a natural disaster equivalent. But you've come along and bought the land next to mine, and now I can't use my borehole of water because one, it's now too deep for me to go and get the water because you've taken it all. And what there is now polluted by your plastic waste ball or whatever.
Mhm.
How is that my freedom?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things are happening in the chat, but I want to respond kind of to what you're saying, Tim. One of the issues is kind of who has standing, right? There's a legal concept of standing, but then I think also in sort of public opinion and in society, right? There's also kind of the idea of, at what point doesn't affect, especially an externality, an external effect become sufficient to be addressable, right? And the thing about externalities is oftentimes they are distant, right? They're in the periphery, not in the center where the economic and social calculations and legal calculations are being made, right? Oftentimes they're distributed, right? So everybody suffers a little while somebody is profiting quite a bit, right? So there's kind of a disparity there. And then oftentimes also, and this I think is the issue with climate, right, that we need to address, is they're in a deeply discounted future, that would be discounted even if the effect were certain, and uncertainty increases the discounting exponentially. Right. And so, so that the only argument that I've seen that people have gained any really kind of traction with so far is that this is an extinction level, a global extinction for humans, because that's all we hear about, event. And so even if it's highly unlikely, if the stakes are that high, then maybe we ought to think about it. So I think those are some of the challenges that once they pivot and they're maybe towards the end of the book talking even more explicitly about climate, that they'll need to
well in terms of the way this economic theory is going, and recognizing that Friedman, at least in this narrative, and I'm not quite sure that's wholly true, it seems as though from the reading of the early part of chapter 10, for instance, that Friedman managed to convince Maggie, and Maggie was part and parcel of how he then convinced Reagan to deregulate stuff. And in the process of all that, in the UK, Maggie started the selling off of all those government-owned things that particularly were utilities. And so the pollution element has come back and bitten us on the arse recently, UK-wise, is the water companies all got privatized into super mega sized watershed brackets, with the odd quirk where, for instance, Bristol City has its water supply from two different watersheds, but it was always Bristol City water. It wasn't Southwest water or West water or whatever.
Mhm.
And
Seems like
those,
there's some logic involved in that, thinking about the entire watershed simultaneously.
yeah, yes. I mean, one of the things that I quite like is how would you overcome the stupidity of gerrymandering in a ecological way?
Mhm.
And to me, I can't control the atmosphere, but I can clearly control the watershed,
Mhm.
because it's very rare that somebody picks the water up from this valley and pushes it over the mountain into the next. You know,
Except if you're
California
Los
might do
Angeles.
California might do it, but California as a whole is doing it between several watersheds. But there's an element of logic.
Well, California, I mean, Los Angeles, they got the Owen River Valley, and then, then they got the Colorado River. I mean, they're going way far away.
But in the UK, those water companies that get their income comes from supplying water,
Mhm.
have ignored investment in sewage.
Right.
So the sewage capacity is now less than the outgoing water, and almost all water going out comes back.
Mhm.
Right? So periodically, they're having to let raw sewage go into the environment.
Mhm.
And in the process to protect those investments, the UK government has effectively defunded and semi-deregulated the UK version of the EPA and the people that work for the EPA, such that there's just too many places for them to check. They can't monitor it.
Mhm.
And now, of course, they've been caught out big time, because we used to be, back when Cameron first took over, proud of the fact that we used to get certified clean beaches. Almost everywhere in the UK was a certified clean beach from external NGO type third party scoring people that we trusted. Now we've lost almost all of those because there's too much shit on the beach. And yet those companies are still paying big bonuses to their boss team and big dividends out, but apparently they've got no money to invest.
Mm.
So in that context, as in, we've given you for free a service that was publicly owned.
Mm.
You've been allowed to run it as a money-making machine on one aspect only, and you haven't bothered to play the downside aspects. We've been allowed, by whatever corrupt mechanism that has arisen, to cheat the system, and now you're turning around saying, I don't have the money to invest. Tough. Is it tough on everybody? Yes, at the moment. Why is it not tough on those people that live near the top of the hill, as opposed to those people near the bottom of the hill that now get shit floods as opposed to just muddy water floods, etc., etc.
Yeah.
With all the contingent health problems and the reduction in the health service, etc., 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 etc. So, and that doesn't seem to be either brought out particularly well in chapter 10, nor does it seem to say this is how they think they've got it solved, or tough luck, you've got the freedom to move house.
Yeah, the
Come and
whole
buy, sell your $10,000 house and come and buy the one next to me for 10 million.
yeah.
You've got that freedom.
Yeah, and you're free to do that, right? And that was why the sleeping under the bridge line was I thought relevant to mention at that point. One of the things that this reminds me of kind of is that and sort of this public private argument, the argument that because in chapter 10 there they say that, well, Friedman sort of seems to have believed that private monopolies, when they're bad, it's probably because of something that the government had done. It was the government's fault anyway. And that it reminds me of the 2000. Remember in 2000 there was this water war in Bolivia, and what happened was because of the World Bank and Bolivia wanting under a guy, a president who had been a dictator. Had been installed in a military coup, but then later had been elected president somehow, a guy named Hugo Banzer. They decided that they wanted, in order to get World Bank money, they were going to allow for privatization, right? They were going to encourage privatization. And so what they did was they went to, Cochabamba, which was a city of like 600,000 people, in a valley in the Altiplano, and they privatized. They put a bid out. There was only one respondent to the bid, and it was and they created a shell company called Aguas de Tunari, which is the mountain above Cochabamba with the glacier on it, but it was Bechtel basically. And Bechtel is a U.S. contractor. They built the Hoover Dam, and more recently they built a lot of big government projects like nuclear power plants. And so they got this bid to privatize the water system in Cochabamba, which more than half of the city wasn't connected to. Like only a third of the people were connected to it. So not only did they not have a sewage option, they really didn't have a running water to the house option. There are a lot of people in the city who were getting water out of standpipes that were in various places, but there was a whole sort of thriving business of people who would bring spring water in from the countryside in trucks, people called tanqueros, and they would drive around the city, and people would buy a 5-gallon jug of water from them, every couple of days, and so they made those illegal. They banned capturing rainwater from your roof. That was also illegal, and they jacked up, and the price of water, metered water, increased like tenfold, and still only about a third of the city was connected. And so their plan, because they said, well, we're going to modernize everything. We're going to do all these things. And I guess my point is that it all looks so great on paper, right? Oh yeah, 100% of the people are going to have water now. It's going to work. Okay, it will be a little bit more expensive starting out, but, and it never, and so so they get what they want, and then the other stuff never happens. Of course, the upshot of that was there was a water war. There were people killed in demonstrations, and Evo Morales, who was at the time the head of the Cocaleros union in the countryside outside of Cochabamba, rose to national prominence.
But this also picks up with the early part of this book and the myth book we read a couple of books back with Naomi and Eric doing their chapter on the Green New Deal, putting rural electrics in through the US,
Mm-hmm.
as in the companies couldn't and wouldn't do it because they didn't see it as being a viable Yet, of course, those companies now benefit because they're supplying the electric to all the houses now.
Mhm.
Um,
Under the, yeah, in the Rural Electrification Act, especially
right.
during the New
So
Deal.
government apparently does no good except it enables
Yeah.
enough. for
Well,
people making-
yeah, it's weird. I mean, there was a whole, there's a whole sort of forgotten history in between, the first Gilded Age and, and the New Deal, and then the reaction to the New Deal and all that. During the first Gilded Age, there were people. I mean, there was an American Public Ownership League, right, that was talking, very intelligently about natural monopolies and about the idea that, you can't, and was using examples, actually was already using examples from Europe. I mean, one guy, the guy that I studied went over to, and traveled by train in Switzerland. And the Swiss had just right around 1899, they had a national referendum and they nationalized their rail industry. And so this guy, experienced that, and reported on it and used it as an example. They wrote, they did actual economic, sort of data-driven studies about, about the gas co-op, about the gas business in Kalamazoo, and what a co-op would look like, and things like that. And so it's weird, there was this, I guess where I'm going with this is that there was an attempt to talk about data, right, and to talk about facts and to talk about actual measurements and do experiments and see what the results were. And this group that they're sort of chronicling in this book, this Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers oriented, kind of conservatives, which I thought it was kind of interesting that the Hayek objection to, to sort of not being a conservative, right, because that would tend, because that and what he was, between the lines, what he was saying is that was a religious, yeah, it's Chinatown. That was a religious position, right? This conservatism is, don't bother me with facts. I know what I know, and I believe what I believe. And so I thought Hayek was kind of onto something there, where he said, it tends to, to sort of reinforce the status quo, right? For all those reasons, right? That that the people who have the means, I thought I actually that whole passage about how, how Friedman is talking about, oh, it's great in America where anybody can say anything as long as you can find a rich sponsor to pay your way. I also wanted to we sort of went by the chat conversation about that. Maybe we want to return to about lies being accepted as free speech. And it's too bad that Pat is off the line now, because I think he was he has a point of view about that. One of the things that strikes me about that is this idea that this is an argument, right? All of a sudden we're having this argument about lies being accepted as free speech, right? That, it used to be possible to be wrong and you would be ignored, right? Or you would, Tucker Carlson hasn't shut up. Yeah. But as as I think, I mean, wasn't that a Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow meme for a while, that they are not news, they are not journalists, they are entertainers, right? And so what they're putting out there on the airwaves did not claim, and I think people actually used this this argument first on Maddow, right? That, nobody believes what she's saying. This is, they're there to be entertained. The idea that censorship especially in social media, should be based on whether or not the thing that is said is true, I think goes back to that thing that I put in the chat about, not being able to trust experts anymore. What do you want to? You look like you're waiting to say something.
There's a piece of that too goes into, and even related to other books we've read, like Too Much to Know. There now literally is so much to know, you can't rely. And in general, one of the other points Hutchins makes in his book is the value of the humanities is it gives you a kind of 2,000-year common view of what at least Western culture is all about.
Mhm.
And if you have that grounding, even if you're not a mathematician, within that study, you've got at least enough math to know where it came from, where it might be going, how it works, how it's supposed to work, that when somebody in category theory comes up with a new theorem, even if you don't understand it in particular, you're at least you've got enough grounding that you can trust that what they're saying is truth.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you're so overwhelmed with everything and you don't have that broader context anymore, that you're left with trusting people based on social or family ties, or you can trust them because they're your tribe, and that's the only way you've got to trust them, because you can't use critical thinking and bigger contexts anymore. Or you trust them because they're your pastor and they're your religion. So even if they're spewing stuff that's not true about the way socialism and democracy works, they're part of your tribe, so what they're saying must be true.
Mhm.
You see this it plays out from the 50s to the 80s into now, with the shift from like the Sunday morning political talk shows into infotainment political talk shows.
Mhm.
Back in the day, everybody had a shared context. They knew what the general topic was,
Mhm.
and they weren't experts. But they're not anymore.
Mhm.
They shifted from being experts to being just dangerous enough. But they then started leveraging the fact that we used to be experts and we used to know all the arguments for and against. Now we're just arguing for what we think.
And we
we
look
really
like them still.
we,
So
we
if you're
still
not
look like
paying
it, but
close
we're not.
attention, you might be fooled.
And if you dig in and you use but the problem is the whole thing becomes what is called a gish galop, which is a rhetorical, and usually it's used in political frameworks and it's used to great value by Trump. You can say so many untrue things in a stream so quickly, they can't all be tested
Fact checked
against,
in real time. Yeah.
and so
But
you
it's,
get lost.
Yeah.
but
But
it's like,
the people who aren't lost are the people who hear it and believe it because
Right.
it sounds right, not because it is right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
but,
and because
but it's,
it's funny too, because in the to pull it back just for a second into economics, right, which is sort of what they're talking about in the text here. I mean, the whole question of positive versus normative, right? We used to distinguish between those things, right? And even the classical economists were not confused about this, but they weren't standing where we thought they were standing, right? Because writing the Minor book was an inquiry on the wealth of nations. That was really kind of an afterthought, right? The theory of moral sentiments was the big one, right? That he thought was his sort of defining opus, right? So but the idea that somehow the idea that that positive is truer than normative truth, right? That positive statement, and that economics is a positive science, right? That it deals in just the facts, ma'am, right? And that's why it has authority, because it has some type of truth claim to make about the way the world really works. It's weird.
But you also have those experts that were deemed to be use the word honest broker, I suppose, at one point. And classic example is, I mean, Chris mentioned Heard versus Montana court case, a few bits of chat up, and Montana employed Judith Curran as a geophysicist, professor of climate change for Georgia Institute of Technology, and an ex-NASA expert. Except she's now a shill, basically, for the climate change is not what you think it is. It's not what the science consensus tells you it is, and it's not going to be anywhere near as bad, blah, blah, blah. So although her evidence was submitted, they didn't actually call her to give verbal statement and be cross-examined.
Mm.
This time around in Montana, it's not clear why they didn't. Other than I don't think she performs well now in court. She comes over as being not the person she used to be, right?
Mm.
And so she's stopped doing normal work. I mean, she's been an associate professor, an Erasmus professor for like 20 plus years, with 200 odd papers for climate change. And slowly but surely they've drifted off the consensus line, saying it won't be as bad, can't be as bad, that it's not right. And even this year, it's like, you know, what do you mean there's a hurricane in California? They had one in 1939. It's normal.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, normal's like 4 or 5 in a season, you know, Atlantic coast type thing. Or, you know, a typhoon, as in sort of Hong Kong, Japan, or down in Indonesia, or Philippines. But, you know, for the Western coast to have one is not a common event, you know. And it's the other one that I thought hasn't come up again yet, or if it did, I missed, was at one point there was like 97% of climate scientists. Now it's 99.9, and there was or maybe 5-year-old paper which includes John Cook. And John Cook's the guy out of George Mason University on climate change communication.
Mm-hmm.
And he went through and did the big meta-analysis paper on, let's pick up 30,000 climate papers and see what the percentage is. And it was like 99.9999 is positive when it's happening, roughly how big it is, what we need to do, etc. And it's like, and as I said this before, I think the thing that got me back into this was when Scientific American particularly, and the scientific community, decided to jump on some poor statistician called Bjorn Lomborg when he came up with The Skeptical Environmentalist, which was a great book in like 1980, 81, 82, or whatever it was. was written in such a way that provided you could read through the politics, it did touch on all the big and good topics to talk about, just gave you the wrong answer.
Yeah, it's interesting. The climate, that article that I just posted about Judith Curry sort of describes her as a delayer, which is an interesting kind of a perspective, right? Because that was what, you know, and the writing was on the wall, right? Because Exxon Mobil, as well as BP, actually, you know, I mean, BP in, I don't know, between 2010 and 2015, published a plan for the future all the way up to 2035. And basically they made two major claims in that document. And one of them was that, you know, peak oil wasn't a problem because of shale oil and tar sands, which hadn't been classified as oil previously. And so that, you know, even if it didn't mean that it wasn't a fine, you know, that it, you know, it didn't say, well, okay, it's not a finite resource. It is still a finite resource, but the window is so much wider, or the horizon is so much longer than we thought it would be, because we can convert these things. But then also it said, you know, we're going to burn as absolutely as much as possible between now and, you know, and 2035, because at that point we've not that they thought there would be significant environmental changes that they would have to deal with, but that they thought that, you know, that the kind of the climate of public opinion and government action would be enough by that point, that it would no longer be profitable. So yeah.
If we go back to the thing about is a lie a lie.
Yeah, let's do that.
It seems to me that there have been, at least at some point, formalized distinctions allowing, well, distinctions, right? So, you know, newspapers have news and they have an opinion section.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an effort to differentiate those two kinds of inputs. It just seems to me that didn't political ads used to be, I mean, I'm trying to think of examples. I thought political ads used to have to be tagged as such, so people aren't confused. And the third example I can think of, I think I mentioned in the chat, is
search results. Yeah,
search results. You know, you can add and you can use ads in search results, but you need to differentiate them or
sponsor.
Well, you know, okay, the top two things say ad, and then you get that are relevant to your search, but they're clearly ads.
Mm-hmm.
Or ad supported, and then later it's their algorithmically derived information sources.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if those distinctions are going away, or if people don't care about them anymore. Is it all too complex that different information sources,
right?
Even if
it's an example of a market failure, right? Because this is exactly the type of thing that they were talking about in the context of, you know, the problem with Friedman, right, is that he would have argued that the market will take care of this, right? That people will, you know, that when the New York Times says one thing and it turns out to be not true, you know, the expectation is that they would have to go back and say, oops, sorry, we got it wrong. Hunter Biden's laptop was real, you know, or what we said about COVID, you know, although it was, you know, even if it was sincerely, you know,
if it was the
science, if it was sincerely believed at the time, and it was based on the science, the best science that was available at the time, and that science turns out to, you know, to not be complete or correct, that there would be some type of responsibility to set the record straight, or to say that I mean, and this is actually the problem, you know, in my other life as a person getting ready to lose his job, that I kind of feel about, you know, sort of what's gone wrong at my university, right, is that nobody is responsible, right? There's no And I think it would be valuable to actually be able to say, this was a mistake. These things were done wrong. We failed to do this, and we'll do better, right? It just if only, I mean, not in terms of like saving my job or anything, but it, just in terms of reassuring the public and the students that,
Well, is there such a thing as an honest mistake
yeah,
versus a dishonest mistake?
right, which may be the
Well,
question, which may be the operative question in the McNamara issue.
Well, it also sounds too like the build up in the between, I guess, like the Meiji Restoration in Japan and leading into World War II is their Senate or the equivalent of it essentially kind of looked at the emperor as saying, he could do no wrong, but they were the ones making all the decisions, and no one was willing to speak up and say, no, this is not true. So it was all yeses until their end of the war.
Mhm.
And then afterwards, I even internally, I don't think there was ever kind of oh, we're sorry. It was just this kind of national nightmare and shame.
Right? Or
Which
denial of things like the Nanjing massacre.
Yeah, and in a shame-based culture, it's a tough thing. So it's no one ever says we're sorry, but we kind of lead ourselves down this primrose path of not ever saying something's wrong,
Mhm.
and then you find yourself in a problem. And to some extent, America's been following that same path, but we're following it in a culture that's been that broadly you can say is a very me culture. We're all looking out for ourselves, and so we don't look out the way, and many indigenous cultures are built more towards what will my impact today have on my grandchildren or my grandchildren's grandchildren. We don't ask that question. It's what's in it for me right now,
Right now,
and
yeah.
who cares, all the rest of the consequences be damned. So we go down this primrose path until we're too far down it to recover from the cultural problem we had.
Mhm. Also, it's very binary,
So we say yes until,
right? I mean,
yeah.
there's no complexity. I mean, and that, going back to things we've read before, is democracy at work, right? We have X or we have Y. We have two choices, and it's winner take all, and there's no consensus. There's no discussion, right? There's no collaboration. There's no there's just none of that
Well,
would add complexity and nuance.
we also don't seem to be defining ourselves, and because of where we're at, I'll say the United States or maybe the West. We don't seem to be defining ourselves by who we are, who we want to be, but we're defining ourselves by what we're against instead.
Mhm.
So for most of the 20th century, we're against communism, we're against Russia, we're against the Soviet Union, and there's a Cold War. And then as soon as that collapses, we don't know who we are anymore.
Mhm.
We've been building this separate myth along the way, or separate multiple myths along the way.
Mhm.
So then suddenly we don't, in the 90s and the 2000s and on, what are we against now? We don't have anything to be against. So we've decided we're going to be against ourselves, and it's going to be left versus right. And we're fighting internally because we don't have the enemy that we're able to focus on as a group against something else.
Right.
And then we've lost the who are we? Are we capitalists? Are we religion based? Are we something else? There's the 57 other things that make up who we are.
Mhm.
And by 57, I'm making a pointed nudge towards the Heinz Corporation.
Yes. Yeah.
For the future historians who will
For the future historians who wonder whatever happened to John Kerry.
Yeah. But you know, it's a symbol of American corporate, like here's an American, it's as American as ketchup on French fries, but really, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Well,
and that also kind of brings us back to that idea that we can only have one, we can only have team A or team B. And so if religion matters to us and capitalism matters to us, they have to be wedded together inseparably, right? Because we can't be in different clubs. Yeah, I don't know. I have my daughter lives in Pittsburgh now, so I'm Team Heinz, I guess. I got a Heinz T-shirt that's ketchup colored with the Heinz logo on it. Says Heinz Pittsburgh, all over it. I don't know. It's the binary. I mean that whole. I mean, going back to Graeber and Wengrow and Candiarand, right? If you're sitting at a council fire and you have to get consensus, then you probably have to be smarter. And so maybe the thing that's happened, maybe that thing that happened, in the Cold War, maybe that contributed to sort of the dumbing down of American politics and the turning it into a cartoon.
I had a U.S. history teacher in high school. I think it was a junior level class, although I think I took it as a sophomore. And I'll preface this with, he was a local church minister and a basketball coach. And those two identities far superseded any identity he had as a historian of any.
Absolutely.
That's or as a teacher history. Or an educator.
Social studies.
Those things came first. But he, the whole theory of his class were the kind of the 5 tenets of democracy. And one of them was, rule by the majority, which is great. But another one was a respect for the minority view. And that you didn't just run roughshod over everyone because the majority was this way or that. And more so in a space where, the majority may only be 51%. So you have to have enough respect for the minority that the 49% don't come after you and kill you because, you don't want that. But we seem to have totally lost any respect for the minority on either side, or even, the logical center. It's all far right, far left. And
Well, go back to the UK disaster. One of the 4 or 5 big voices for Brexit, a few weeks before the vote, said if it's 51% 49, that needs to go to another vote. And as soon as it was 51.1% and 48.9%, it's okay, we're done. It was that time. Brexit. And now, of course, one of the other big voices for Brexit is saying, oh, yeah, the benefits will come, but it'll take 50 years. As opposed to the campaign bus.
I was going to ask you about that because I remember the campaign bus. Yeah.
£350 million a week. I'm still waiting for my week, please. Because I may not be there now, but I paid all of my working life in the UK has been under EU or the predecessor of the EU. We effectively joined in 75, I think. And one of the things that I took a note of, and a slight exception, in somewhere early in chapter 10, was where the UK got used, or the Brit got used as the example that he can't enjoy a holiday in the US because of currency restrictions.
Right.
Back in, I think, 71, 72, 73, a normal tourist couldn't take out more than £50. So like $60 now. But back then, they were like $4 to the pound.
Right.
And
I remember that.
I got caught out. But on the positive side, I had a German guy come over and he ran out of money. So I gave him 10 quid, which at that point, Easter of 72, might be 73, meant that he was going to give me 100 Deutschmarks in Germany in August when we swapped back over.
Mm-hmm.
And in between Easter and August, it went from 10 Deutschmarks to the pound to 4 and something. So I actually came back with more money than I left with, having spent a decent amount of money in Germany at the same time.
Mm. Oh.
And,
Yeah.
but
It's kind of I was wondering about the Brexit. I mean, because that was even before before people in America started using terms like, I guess it was about the same time we started hearing about alternate facts, right?
So all this reminds me that politics is like the Hollywood agent who dies, and he's right on the border. So God and the devil decide, we'll let him make his own decision. So he goes up to heaven and he sees a bunch of people floating on clouds and strumming their lyres, and it seems all right. Then he goes down to hell, and the devil shows him what hell looks like. It's a big, massive party. People are doing drugs. There's a lot of sex, rock and roll, and Hollywood agent's like, wow, this is the place for me. So he goes back to St. Peter and he says, I'll pass. I'm gonna go with these other guys. So he goes down, and then suddenly on day one, he finds himself not just in, the first level of Dante's hell, but he's living all the levels. And he complains and he says, what gives? Where's the party I saw last week when, and the devil comes up to me and he says, well, we were showing you the thing. Now you're a client.
Yep.
But that seems to be what politics has become, is we'll show you all the pretty stuff that we think you want to hear and see and that you have. But then the reality of now you're
the guy that's come back and said the benefits will take 50 years, right, is in part, he's an MP, right? But he's also a hedge fund manager. And literally on the vote, he moved his company from London, which was the financial centre of the world, to Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
So he could keep the EU business.
Mm-hmm.
Really, that's not a problem. I wasn't lying.
Well,
here's the picture of the bus that says you're going to get 350 million a week.
But the guy living under the bridge is equally free to move to Dublin, right?
No, not necessarily. No, if you want to become a resident in Dublin under the EU rules, you need an EU passport from one of the other 25 countries now. You can't, as a Brit, as a right, go and reside in Ireland. So about half of all my friends who were spread across Europe, including the guy that had married a Czech woman and was living in the Czech Republic, happy as Larry, who doesn't even have a British passport, has had to go home. Because where does he live? He lives in the Isle of Man. That's not even in the United Kingdom. It's a Crown property. So you get a British passport from somewhere else, like people from Hong Kong get a British passport from somewhere else.
Mm.
Or as the latest meme I saw about the Canary Islands that have got no canaries, and the Virgin Islands got no canaries either. So I'm in the quirk of Britain, the British Isles, which includes the Republic of Ireland. It includes the Channel Islands and it includes the Isle of Man. And yet, when we want a dirty bank, we move it to one of the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man, because then its day-to-day running is under British law. British law, which includes Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, right? By conquest and by dodgy dealings for the Union of 17, whatever it was. And yet, when it's too dirty for the City of London, they'll move it to the Isle of Man or Jersey. So here, I can bank under British laws as applicable for UAE, but I do it via a Jersey-based bank.
Wow. Whatever happened to Scotland, the whole referendum to leave the United Kingdom and join Europe?
It's been told it can't do it yet.
Oh.
But for one, of course, that's a real beaut from a British Empire point of view, is the current leader of Scotland is a Indian Muslim, Pakistani Muslim, and the current leader of the UK is an Indian Hindu.
Hindu, yeah.
Between them, they're going to agree whether Scotland can go or not.
Nice.
But they haven't.
That's the revenge of empire.
They haven't quite figured out Northern Ireland yet.
Yeah.
So Brexit is sort of done, but not.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's like there's all this. Oh, look, the UK is really doing well. There's a increase in the value of the money. That's like this week's graph. If you go back to like the week before the vote, it's up here, and now it's gone up. It's gone up about that much, and it was well up above here on the week before the vote.
Right.
So yes, it's improved over the last week or last 2 weeks, but you're still screwed compared to, let's go back to being $4 to the pound.
Yeah.
And then we can all come to you for a holiday. We can afford, we can afford a McDonald's in the US as opposed to not affording McDonald's in the UK.
So which is the most recent of these Kevin Phillips books? It looks like Kevin Phillips has written a lot of books, Chris.
The American Theocracy, I think, may be one of the more recent ones.
Okay.
Some of his earlier stuff was written and it influenced the Republican Party much earlier on. I've got dates for most of them if I can sort them out. Oop.
I was trying to.
A lot of his stuff is. I've got Wealth and Democracy was 2002, I think. American Theocracy was 2006, and then Bad Money is 2009.
Okay.
But he's writing that stuff after a 40-year career doing Republican consulting and politics, I think. But I've been super curious about the overlap of like the shifts in religion from the late 1880s onward and the impacts that has had in the US.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's I think that's an interesting. Yeah, I think that's a big topic. Oh yeah, it's dedicated to millions of Republicans.
But I also presume too that I mean, he's an interesting enough theorist in things that he predicted demographically that would change through the like 70s and 80s, that he's got at least some intellectual honesty, but he's also going to necessarily be writing as a person who thinks and believes a very specific, perspective.
So it looks like he's coming from a traditional Republican anti-evangelical move that Bush made kind of a position.
I don't know anti-evangelical. I don't know what his religious viewpoint is.
Okay.
But I think he's a person who, as a strategist, looks at religions that are extant and have influence and thinks, how can we leverage this for the party's benefit? And then go from there.
Oh, that would be interesting,
yeah. In terms of reading him, I wouldn't read him the way I would read Ralph Reed, who is a believer of a certain thing, but I would read him as a believer who believes in other believers and what can they do for me.
Okay.
Which kind of fits into that kind of me attitude of how can I use the beliefs of others to benefit myself?
Right.
Because
interesting index anyway. Yeah. Cool. Okay. But
I've only just begun kind of delving into bits and pieces of stuff, essays he's written and things he's done. But that book in particular, I think, looks like it has a lot of interesting overlap with some of the things we've read before and what we're looking at, right now.
Cool.
Particularly from that religion angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the thoughts on how that pairs with my plain simple reading of what the 20-odd signatories on the treasonous piece of paper said, as in, this is not a Christian nation?
Well, Jefferson specifically said that when he was talking to people in the context of the Muslim controversy in the Barbary Pirates period. So again, that going back to that question of when are people telling the truth and when are they and when are they not? I think that's complicated. I've always I kind of came into that whole thing, or kind of came into reading a lot into reading a lot of American history in grad school, thinking that the idea that evangelical kind of Bush era, the thing that came up in the Bush era, that we're a Christian nation, damn it, and all that, all of the kind of Glenn Beck and and Pat Buchanan kind of stuff was overdone and exaggerated. I do think now, having read more of American history and read more primary sources, I think there were a lot of people for whom those assumptions actually were valid, but I don't know that that's necessarily as meaningful as people would like it to be. I mean, it's almost like sort of the originalism, or strict construction of the Constitution. I'm not sure that how much I actually care about the intent of the writers in the way that they would like me to care in order to sort of sustain the arguments that they want to make. I think that maybe we've put too much emphasis on that, because again, that's a binary: Christian nation, not Christian nation. Really, those are only, are those, is that the most relevant thing, you know,
And
and,
of
and
course,
does it mean the
Roman-
things, and does it mean the things we think it means? You know, if it was a Christian nation, was it what they understand as a Christian nation? I don't think so.
Or my favorite was Bill O'Reilly on a regular basis didn't use the phrase Christian nation, but he always said Judeo-Christian
Mhm.
and said it for 15 plus years. But it doesn't ever seem that his audience caught on to the word Judeo in what he was saying. It was they heard the phrase and they heard him say it, but because I'm Christian, who cares about the other piece of it? That's not.
And of course, you've never had a Jew in the White House.
No.
And but I still think
Lieberman, I think, was the closest, maybe.
You've had, I mean, you guys have had, who's your first? Lionel de Rothschild, right? Because Disraeli was by the time he was Prime Minister, Church of England. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the whole, and that whole question of what Buchanan or O'Reilly or stuff was saying, how much of that is really, how much of it is code? How much of what they're doing is just, are they just signaling? And somebody hears, like you said, Chris, somebody hears Judeo-Christian and they heard the Christian part, so check the box, stop.
But that's the sort of thing that I was thinking of in terms of you've got the white supremacist that goes through and says one drop is all what it takes to make you not white. Obama's not black and Obama's not white because he's 50-50, right? So if I wanted to put Michelle Obama into the White House, she would be the first black person, right? But Obama doesn't count as white because he's only half white.
Well, he also isn't African American because in the way that they, I mean, because these terms are so poorly defined, right? I mean, he's not somebody who came through, his ancestors were slaves. His father was a Kenyan, right? So, a complete end run around the whole black experience in America thing.
But
except to whatever extent he, as a child in America or as a college, in Hawaii or as a college student in the mainland, experienced the black experience.
But then how much of his father's immediate family back in, say, the 1700s were or were not slave anyway?
I don't know.
Because
Kenya
is a source country for slaves for here, for instance, same as Djibouti and Sudan and so on. So there may not be the American slave back then, and I'm quite happy that it's not. But there might have been slave, in the same way as my Irish part of the family would be quite easily white slave.
Well, or if you're talking about people in Africa, whose ancestors were in Africa and they're in Africa, how many of them in Congo or Angola were not slaves but were slavers?
You said about the Christian bit, or in terms of Jefferson's, more to do with the Barbary pirates.
I don't think he was right. I think he was writing. Yeah, I think he was writing to somebody who was non-Christian and saying, "Hey, we don't have a beef on religious grounds." Is the way I read that.
But they were very often the primary collectors of people, and then they went to the various big slave ports and acted as a market.
Oh, absolutely. And Jefferson, of course, wasn't averse to that.
No. So the other thing that came up, I thought, within this was, I mean, I think they touched it again in chapter 10 and bits and pieces earlier, was all of those other elements of the racism for the freedom to enjoy the market just doesn't seem to match. So, you know, you've got zoning laws on housing that says no Jew, no Negro, no Irish.
Right. Even when we don't have redlining, we still have zoning.
Yeah.
Yeah. In our history.
And one of the places I dip into on that tends to bend more on environmental stuff, but occasionally picks up on why things are the way they are from a more historical point of view, is one of the channels that talks about urban planning, particularly from the North American, not just US. And one of those, not just one episode, but several episodes, bring up, there's a TV interview post World War II where the white family, the mother of the white family, is talking to the interview, and it's clear. Oh, the zoning law means that we can't have any black neighbours, which is good because it keeps the value of our house up. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then, of course, you've got all those landlords that are biased, that are Germanic, Scots, hybrids.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I mean, the whole statement. I mean, the white flight thing, you know, is a thing in American history, right? The rush, you know, the rush to the suburbs out of what are now Rust Belt, but at the time were, you know, northern industrial cities, you know, because there was a great migration, you know, in the first half of the 20th century of, you know, black people out of the South into the North, especially into northern industry. But the statement that that you just quoted, Tim, that woman made about home values is nonetheless, in some instances, accurate. And so, you know, and so there, you know, and so it's not, you know, so you know, although we can sort of assume that maybe she prefers a less diverse, you know, she prefers to see white faces in the supermarket. You know, that's not necessarily true if, you know, in a world where the thing that people, you know, that middle class Americans base their financial futures on is the investment in their home. So that you know, and I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying even that is more complicated than, you know, than just the, you know, I'm afraid, you know, the myths. I mean, and there are a lot of stereotypes and a lot of myths, you know, about the danger to women of, you know, black men and stuff like that were promulgated by racists in the South. But yeah, it's crazy complicated.
I think a similar thing exists even today with parents and where their kids go to school, and they're thinking about, legitimately, I guess, about the quality of the education they're experiencing. I mean, in Minneapolis, I see that just in my own kids and their kids,
Sure.
whether they're in the, you know, city proper or in a suburb, for example. You know, so I don't, they can be quite, let's say, open to the value of multiple cultures, but they sure, you know, they know where the good schools are too.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's complicated to explain how those things go together. But, you know, if you were a parent and you had a choice, where would you, and you do in Minneapolis, because you can, you know, send your kids different places. You know, what choice do you make?
Right. Yeah. Well, and at my own, at Bemidji State right now, they just sent out, this thing that the thing that I talked about today was about this survey that they sent out, and obviously it is very clear that the new president came from California or someplace, and his one major priority is diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and so there were some incidents on campus, and so there are a lot of questions on this, because these administrators are formulating these questions for this thing, and so they focus a lot on the intolerance and racism and sexism, yada yada, and my and I was the equity certificate director, right? I wrote the equity certificate program at BSU, and I have to say, if we're actually assessing the existential dangers and challenges and risks for BSU right now, not doing well enough on DEI, although it is a concern and although it is an issue, is not the existential challenge. And so what do you do with that knowledge? I mean, do you even admit it? And I think that we're in a situation where the administration will not admit that, but that prevents them from focusing on the issue that actually is the existential crisis, which is that enrollment is down, retention is down, student success, completion is down, right? Holy shit, what if we found out that because of the students that we have, some of those things are down because of our shift in focus towards DEI? What the hell would they do with that knowledge? If it was actually, if that was actually where the facts took them, would they even be able to see it? Would they be able to process it? Would they be able to admit it? Would they be able to work with it in any way? That's a problem.
Or maybe the alternate thesis that I think is super crazy. Given Graeber's bullshit thesis and how bullshit jobs have come to dominate, do you actually need an education to do those jobs? And it's that part of what's, collapsing everything in the middle is, do you need training? Do you need knowledge? Do you need this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or, you can make an argument that studying and learning about the humanities may help you have eudaimonia and happiness in your life. And then you need, as Charles Eliot and the Harvard educated set and the Yale educated set in the early 1900s with the beginning of Taylorism, you need a technical education to do the technical jobs to make the money. Mm-hmm. So you need a different kind of education than they had been giving out. Your divinity degree is not going to get you as far as Jonathan Edwards had,
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you need something else for the new century. But what happens when you have a whole system built on bullshit jobs, and yet you still need to do an undergraduate, maybe a year or two of a master's degree to be a teacher to make no money?
Yeah.
So I can leave and I could go be a warehouse worker somewhere in a union and make 4 times that money.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's weird because in this, and in this new century, the other things we have, I would not bet any money on anybody's prediction of what particular vocational skill set is gonna be valuable 5 years from now. So I think that is a moment. I think that's another sort of, that's an existential crisis for higher education. What the hell what should we be focusing on teaching people in a world where generative AI is going to replace knowledge, right? So so the things, I mean, and even more so, I think the thing that it comes back to is not just eudaimonia, not just how to be a happy person, but how to be a person as distinct from an agent, a software agent. And I think that we haven't. I mean, I don't think that anybody's cracked that code, but I think that's the puzzle that we should be trying to solve. Not, can we get more tightly integrated with, the businesses in northern Minnesota and prepare more people to become engineers at Polaris? That our technology, art, and design program has a great internship and co-op deal working with Polaris right now, which is being hugely touted by the administration as the model, as the shape of things to come. It's those tight integrations that we're looking for.
Well, it does make me wonder too, because I don't read it regularly, but I dip into it every now and then. But I have been watching, and I read it more probably a decade ago, but I've been watching the Chronicle of Higher Education for a good while.
Mm-hmm.
And through most of the last century, we've only added academic institutions of higher learning. It's incredibly rare that they would go bankrupt or disappear or fall off the map. And it seems to me there is an increasing rapid escalation of schools, universities and colleges going bankrupt or failing or having issues, like Bemidji is now, is just one of many examples that are disappearing, or they're losing their humanities seem to be under enough stress that there are multiple books, not just by academics. But Fareed Zakaria has a book on the value of the humanities. So it's gotten even out of academia, and it's in like popular press books. People are writing about these things. And then to see almost on a weekly basis colleges or universities that are having issues, and some of them may be issues that are kind of post-COVID. How do we bounce back from enrollment problems because people left? And in particular, a lot of like first-time college attendees and their families who were border marginalized, and they could not go to college and maybe get an hourly wage job that's high enough because of what's now happened post-pandemic that, I might be okay for a couple years to not go to college, but then it's going to be that much harder to go later.
Yeah.
But you see these like small colleges are starting to fail and have horrible problems. And, on top of which, since the 80s with Reagan, we have been defunding higher education to the nth degree.
Right. Well, I do think, I agree with you. I do think that 4-year residential college and university is very much an artifact of the 20th century, right? Especially the baby boom and the GI Bill, beginning in the Second World War and then continuing through Korea and, all the way. And I think, it's not sustainable. I mean, even just the demographic, change when there just aren't enough people to okay, fine. Take you to Christmas. I'll be looking forward to it. But you could have Dolly, you create the cover for you.
in terms of numbers of students, the US could just price it such that you get everybody else. Don't need your students to be US students, do you?
Right.
You just need to price it such that the kid from Djibouti can do it.
Yeah. Well, but as more of it, I mean, as COVID taught us, right, more of it can be done, remotely in increasingly effective and actually valuable ways, not just, sort of bullshit online courses from, University of Phoenix. That, yeah, I don't know. I think a lot's going to change. But it's noon and we can't resolve that today.
So did
So
we fix
for
the world
next
this
time,
week?
are we gonna finish the book? Was that the plan?
Yeah, I think we
Right.
could do that.
Okay, and then we need to actually start talking about the next book. But let's do that in the yeah, let's do that in the book suggestions tab there. And then we can decide on it next week.
I know you said there were plugin problems, but if you get a chance, run the change log.
I will try to, yes. Yeah, I tried to, I went in, I may have to like reinstall it or something. I don't know. I tried running it a couple days ago and it wouldn't. So I'll try to dig into it.
What's the plugin that you use that does that?
Let me look. It's a community. Community plugin. Vault changelog version. It's version 0.1.0 by Bader Bushliken. I'll look in the documentation, see if it's still valid or if there's something else that replaces it. Yeah, I'll work on that. I don't have an answer for you right this second.
I've been reading a blog that indicates you have other bigger priorities lately. So
yeah, yeah. Trying to keep all the balls up in the air.
I don't know how you do it.
Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't.
He does it with hypothesis, right?
I
Are you sorry you went to a daily semi-commitment there? I mean, I have a travel blog and I sometimes start it and I start doing it every day, and then I think, man, I wish I wouldn't have done this.
It hasn't been. It hasn't been too
much.
I
would have said maybe I'll write something when something interesting happens. But
yeah, no, it hasn't been too much for me yet. I am kind of looking at 258 days. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have something to say. Did Hypothesis just? I knew that that Jeremy went.
Yeah,
is that a budget thing?
I've not got all the internal details just yet, but we'll have them shortly, I think. But
what's the funding model for Hypothesis anyway? I don't think I ever paid anything.
They're selling it as a product to universities to integrate into.
Oh, that's right.
They were trying to sell an LTI plugin, yes, and I think that was their business plan, but I don't think it was particularly well thought out because they didn't differentiate the university package, substantially from the freebie. And I think initially they were kind of grant funded, and then probably that money.
But a year ago, they got a big $15 million infusion with a big partnership that they announced. And I actually expected them to double the size of their staff and operation with a chunk of that. And so I was a little shocked.
I don't know, maybe they bought a helicopter.
This time. But most of the people
they laid some good sources. I'm kind of interested in that
customer service was what.
Get some good sources for the story.
Pardon?
Do you have some good sources for the situation?
I've got some good starting sources, but within the next week I'll have, I think, the internal.
Okay. Cool. I'd be interested in. Yeah. I mean, I hope they survive because they are great at what they do. I just didn't think that they offered enough of a value proposition to universities in the way that they wanted to do it. And I think ultimately they expected that to be much more of a slam dunk than it turned out to be.
Well, they're also, I think part of their issue is they're much more ethical than any other company in that space.
Right.
And they could have done all kinds of crazy things and probably be making silly money,
Mhm.
but have specifically chosen not to do those things, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I do too. I hope it doesn't prevent them from succeeding.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. See you next week. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye, guys.